Welcome to the lecture on Colonialism, Nationalism and Patriarchy, Part 2. In this lecture, we would be talking about how during the course of national movement, the issue of gender took several twists and turns. One needs to take into account several historical debates about nationalism, class formation, as well as several caste movements that were going on during the period. As a result, what appears is that specific laws like the Widow Remarriage Act and the codification of laws and so many other issues that were being raised from time to time had specific implications on the rights of women. As has been pointed out by Uma Chakravarti in several of her writings, Uma Chakravarti has critically discussed the ways in which different categories of modern nationalists romanticized and mythicized ancient histories. And while this was being done, a specific kind of role was being earmarked for Indian women. As has been discussed by Partha Chatterjee, the way in which several nationalist thinkers divided the world into private and public domains, reserving the public world for masculine activities and allowing women an exalted spiritual authority over the home, which was the private domain. So, the nationalists, especially the extremist leaders, they never wanted the colonial state to interfere in the private domain, because the public world had already been captured by the rulers. They were already the lawmakers, they were already ruling the economy, the polity. So, there was not much for Indians to participate in that. But as far as their private domain, their inner sanctum, their family life, their private life was concerned, Indians never wanted Britishers to interfere in that, because this would mean giving away whatever was left. So, with this kind of fear in mind and this kind of apprehension in mind, there were so many reform movements that were objected to by several Indian thinkers, even educationists, who did not want certain practices to be curbed. And hence, there was a long drawn out debate that went on as far as the concept of questioning child bride, the practice of continuing child marriage in India was concerned. Then another very interesting collection of essays, that is Women in Colonial India, essays on survival, work and the state. It explores several issues related to ordinary women, subaltern women. It explored different facets of women's activities as factory workers, agricultural laborers, or their home based production, their access to law courts, their participation in electoral processes and nationalist movements. So far, we have generally seen that there has been lot of focus on studying about the rulers or the elite leaders, or people belonging to upper caste and class. But unless and until we take into account the lives and survival instincts of ordinary women, we cannot really have a clearer understanding as to what were the real histories of gender. So, histories of gender have moved along these two main trajectories. One which focuses on what patriarchal men did, and the other on women's agency. Here one must mention the very positive role that has been played by feminist scholars who have examined the historical context, class dynamics, and the relationship of law to colonialist and nationalist ideologies at specific movements. So, there has been an attempt to study the limitations of the colonial as well as nationalist hegemonic agendas. So, these feminist scholars do not consider only the British regime as hegemonic, but even the nationalist agenda was hegemonic because it did not really take into account the specific needs and requirements of women on priority basis, and it was very much possessive about the private domain, as has been pointed out by Partha Chatterjee. And who was in charge of the private domain? It was definitely the male head of the family, and hence patriarchy continued to prevail, and in fact it got strengthened. The contradictions between the applications of different sets of legal systems like customary law or statutory law, personal law, and also an attempt to homogenize the diversity of social customs and cultural practices also had a very regressive impact on lives of women, because a number of tribal societies and there were so many other communities in which women had equal rights, or they were far more active producers, and they were also decision makers. But with the attempt to homogenization, the diversity of social customs was compromised. A number of studies have been conducted by Beena Agarwal on the way law shaped gender relations by denying women access to productive resources in the form of land or cattle or so many other resources. Then there is also a need to look at the paternalistic female education. We all know that how in due course of 19th century, Western kind of education, English education, and a new type of education had found its way in India. Men's spearheading of the campaign for women's education, however, was paternalistic. It was a means by which women would be emancipated from an earlier deprivation. So, the whole concept of schooling was to be according to the agenda of the new patriarchy, and the relationship of schooling for women was to be with the process of class formation as well as a gender identity. So, therefore, while education for women was being promoted and a number of schools also came up, and there were so many social reformers and even religious reformers who took up the issue, but the underlying idea was not to modernize women or not to skill them enough so that they could also become independent, but rather it was to make them more informed and more responsible wives and mothers. So, this again had a very limiting goal, straight cut role that had been designed for the females, and educated women had to fulfill those responsibilities. There are a number of letters, memoirs, essays, biographies, poetry, stories, travelogues, and social critiques of patriarchy also, which started appearing by the end of 19th century and continued into the 20th century. So, for any student who is interested in knowing more about this genderization of the whole discourse of nationalism and reformism, it is very important to go through such excerpts. Feminist scholarship on this alternative archive has been significant in fine-tuning our understanding of social reform, and it also reveals as to what was suppressed in the accounts of mainstream history, because the mainstream history or the archival material rarely talks about such private feelings or accounts that have been mentioned in this alternative archive which I have just mentioned. So, there were women like Pandita Ramabai and Taramai Shinde who have become known in the world of feminist scholarship. A very sensitive reading of a seemingly conformist piece of writing by Rashasundari Devi too, however, can uncover or explain a moving critique of upper caste cultural practices. So, it depends on the kind of approach one is using to kind of rewrite history and to kind of revise what has been written already. So, with this kind of revisionist approach, even if we take into account conformist writings, for example by Rashasundari Devi, one can kind of develop a critique of what were cultural, social, religious practices of upper castes in several regional areas. Then coming to the theme of women's education, what was men's stake in women's education and why they had taken up this agenda? So, women's agency and resistance in a conflict ridden household in the process of many kinds of transition has been outlined in several of these feminist scholars' works. Women were drawn into literacy and education mostly at the behest of their menfolk, who wanted to make them more presentable, more someone with whom they could communicate, and also someone who would properly take care of the family, the matters of hygiene, cleanliness, health, good care of children. So, most of the time women were forced into literacy without themselves being interested, but sometimes women also took to writing while they were only expected to read, but some of them, once they had some knowledge about the word, about the alphabet, they also started writing. So, Prem Chaudhary has yielded a very important study of the everyday experiences of laboring women of a peasant caste over 100-year period, and this is another way, an alternative way of understanding the political economy of gender, something that has been attempted by Prem Chaudhary. The use of oral history by feminist historians to critique the limitations and biases of official mainstream male oriented elitist histories is definitely a welcome change, and it is these kind of studies that bring about an alternative narrative. So, an alternative history can only be written from the point of view of the marginalized Dalit, women, children, and they have raised crucial questions about the ideologies of the state in the context of the idea of community, caste, gender, and also the issue of honor of women, and in the course of partition, the recovery and rehabilitation of abducted women. All this has been undertaken as part of the study by these scholars. So, the kind of discrepancies and inequalities that prevailed, they were experienced by women first at the hands of men, then at the hands of a patriarchal state which denied women agency as it tried to align boundaries with communities, as happened in the course of partition of India. So, while many women were left behind in both the countries, ultimately the solution that was suggested was that these women who were leading lonely lives without their family members must be sent back to their respective families without taking into account their own wishes and desires. It is significant that feminist scholarship has provided a systematic critique of not only colonialism but also of nationalism at the very moment of the birth of a new nation. So, with this kind of narrative that is being developed by feminist scholars, no stone is being left unturned to kind of showcase the true picture which existed, or the true reality that had existed in the past. Then another theme that emerges in these kind of studies is the theme of masculinity, as to how masculinity came to be associated with nationalism. So, modern politics developed new models for masculinities and femininities. The colonial rulers had stereotyped Indian men as conservative and unmanly, except for a few martial races like the Sikhs of Punjab. Their opinion had points of dissent as well as points of collaboration with Indians' views on gender. So, therefore, colonialism, instead of questioning the older ideas, kind of reinforced them, and there were several Indians who were also of the same opinion as far as the issue of femininity and masculinity was concerned. So, there were requirements of modern politics towards a political masculinity which was warlike, heroically militant, violent, and in all this women fitted nowhere. So, this image found a very strong support among extremists, among revolutionary leaders, and later among Hindu and Muslim communalists also. So, this further kind of created binaries related to femininity and masculinity. So, we see that as colonialism was progressing, as imperialism was finding its way into India, and as nationalism was evolving, these binaries continued to further harden. Now, let us look at what happened post Gandhian era. There were a number of similarities between Gandhians and revolutionaries. Gandhi's nationalism was gentle, constructive, non-violent, and androgynous. For both, there was, however, a renunciation of sexual desire as a patriotic duty, and both advocated the ideal of celibacy for the patriot. Both shared a notion of highly controlled and disciplined masculine self. While Tagore's idea of nationalism was different, Tagore's preference was for individual self-fulfillment rather than for lives which were only marked by sacrifice. So, Tagore advised patriots to first experience freedom in their own personal lives and relationships. He kind of believed that an over-disciplined and regimented nationalist politics even if it was very noble in purpose, there was lot of morality that was implicit in the idea. However, he was of the opinion that it would constrain and repress individual thinking, imagination, moral sense. So, therefore, it would be ultimately of no use. Now, coming to revivalist nationalists discourses and what impact it had on patriarchy, we can say that by late 19th century, Hindu revivalist nationalist discourses started projecting female chastity as the hope for a future nationhood. For example, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, who wrote the novel Anand Mat, the motherland, was in this the motherland was imagined as the mother goddess and as a sacred symbol of the nation. The partition of Bengal between 1905 and 1908 also kind of unleashed Swadeshi movement, and women were involved by the nationalist leadership to boycott British goods, to use indigenous Swadeshi products for domestic use, to shelter revolutionary terrorists. And from 1930, a number of Bengali revolutionary leaders began to arm women for assassinations of important colonial official figures, started adding them to the underground band of insurrectionaries at Chittagong, which raided the armory and hid in the jungles to escape arrest. So, very active roles were kind of given to women, and a spirit of gender equality, even though the revolutionary themselves were not vocal about social issues, emerged in due course of time. With the onset of Gandhian era, there were changing norms of femininity. Mahatma Gandhi expanded anti-colonial agitations into mass movements of peasants, tribals, middle class from the early 1920s for non-violent non-cooperation against the colonial administration. So, it was in this kind of struggle that women were inspired to join on a large scale, and this completely changed the character of Congress organizations as well as mass movements also. There was an open and active female defiance of social norms and family values that had traditionally restricted women to their homes. So, this was definitely a new beginning for many women who had rarely ventured out of their homes. So, Gandhian politics involved strategic use of traditional kinship practice and emotions as well. For example, during the Khilafat movement in 1921, the mother of Ali brothers, who was a woman from an orthodox Muslim family, began to address large crowds of spectators who were protesting the British abolition of the Turkish Caliphate after the war. So, this was a very unusual scene, that a Muslim woman was addressing a huge crowd, and that too while in the beginning she spoke from behind the veil, and later on she unveiled herself, and as she was addressing the crowds, she addressed them as her children. So, therefore, these kind of examples prove that women were getting a lot of opportunities to come out of their seclusion, to kind of give up parda and come in the public domain and also participate in political deliberations. Then the civil disobedience movement of 1930 to 34, number of peasant women mobilized local organizations and movements. They courted arrest, led demonstrations, and also made illegal salt. So, here again we see women agency coming on its own. there were middle class women who became public speakers. They were very active in demonstrations, they courted arrests. For example, mother of Jawaharlal Nehru, Swaroop Rani, was beaten by police lathis during agitation. Then the Quit India movement of 1942 also was a time when women led the underground networks. However, this radicalism did not translate into a new political femininity, because ultimately Gandhian nationalism clung to the image of the woman as self-sacrificing and nurturing mother. So therefore, this limiting ideology continued to prevail even in due course of Gandhian movement and mobilization. Autobiographies of women tell how their political choice had abruptly hijacked them out of their own social and familial setup. The wife of a senior Bengali bureaucrat left her children behind for a year, and they were brought up by their father as she went to Noakhali in Bengal in 1946. So these were definitely changing times, new roles that were being assumed by women, and how they were in due course of time getting radicalized, and also kind of they were not considering themselves only as domesticated beings. But if we look closely, there also appear a number of ambivalences in Gandhian ideology. The ideology of peaceful disobedience of unjust laws bridged the gulf between gender norms of nationalist masculinity. Mahatma Gandhi insisted that men should do what women often do at homes. So he was kind of authenticating the passive role played by women at homes, where they do not shout back, they do not hurt, they do not react even if they are treated badly. And this is exactly what he wanted Satyagrahis also to do in the public domain. Passive resistance to objectionable behavior, as well as cleaning, spinning, healing, thereby bridging the gap between gender practices, but at the same time validating the passive roles that were being played out by women in their domestic sphere. Paradoxically, Gandhi appreciated feminine qualities as the epitome of an ideal patriarch, asking women always to remain gentle and self-sacrificing, thereby promoting conventional feminine norms and values like self-sacrifice, submission, self-denial. Then there were a number of other Congress leaders also, like Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhash Chandra Bose, who were committed to equal rights for women. When Subhash Chandra Bose raised the Azad Hind Fauj, which was an army from among prisoners of war under Japanese occupation in 1941, he encouraged the formation of an all-women's armed unit, the Rani Jhansi Brigade, to combat British Army. By early 20th century, women's own exclusive political organizations began to develop in cities with middle class and upper middle class patronage. These organizations, however, were in a dilemma whether to cooperate with colonial rulers to bargain for gender rights, or to dedicate themselves to anti-colonial mass movements, postponing issues of female franchise and rights till independence. Nationalist movement dictated that they relegated to the background gender issues till independence, and this is exactly what they did. Thank you.